So welcome back. We're holding in chapter Yud, Perek Yud, 10th chapter of Sharichad Memuna. We do believe that we will conclude the chapter this week. We thought so perhaps last week, but it did not happen. But this week, it's possible, more so probable, that we'll be able to conclude this chapter. We're holding on page Peches in the original text, and you can see it in the corresponding English text pretty much towards the end of the chapter. Kind of, we would say, the last fifth of the chapter begins V'chein b'yom sheni, so too in the second day. So what's the Alter Rebbe talking about? Go back to the previous classes, wherever you're watching it, as we mentioned time and again. As you're watching this class, wherever you're watching it, always good to go back to the original, or there's an advantage to go back to the original website, where you have all the classes, previous classes lined up, and so too in Sharichad Memuna. So to know what's going on in the previous class, in the previous chapters, or even in the previous classes within this very chapter, it's click away, tanyaonline.com. The original website, tanyaonline.com. You have the advantage that we mentioned this time and again for the newcomers, namely, you could follow this text is on a separate scroll bar as such, easy to follow the class, and so too easy access to all the previous classes that come up in the same manner, in the same fashion, and as such easy to follow. So if you want to know what the Alter Rebbe is talking about in this previous chapter, just it's a click away, or in this chapter in previous classes, that is, it's a click away. And yeah, it also comes in continuation of the previous chapters, Ches and Tes. It's pretty much of a follow-up. We did mention a few times in the past the precision of the Alter Rebbe in his order of the chapters. We did even add to that. Not always you understand it, you perceive it, but you learn time and again. If it's Likutei Amorim or Sharichad Memuna, any of the works of the Alter Rebbe, the organization of the Alter Rebbe in his writings was extraordinary. And particularly when you're talking about the Tanya, which is the magnum opus of the Alter Rebbe, Likutei Amorim, Sharichad Memuna. We know the Tanya, there's the 5 compartments of Tanya. Likutei Amorim, Sharichad Memuna, Igeres HaTshuva, Igeres HaKodesh, and then Kuntres Sachen. We merited to conclude Likutei Amorim, and it's all on the site also, which is the largest. And when you usually say Tanya, you could even say them. You could even justifiably say when you say Tanya, it's usually Likutei Amorim, but nonetheless, it's all part of the the dynamic of the Alter Rebbe's work, as called the Teres Shebiksav of Teres Achsidus. The foundation, the basis, the written Torah of Teres Achsidus is known, and it's the entire Tanya. But Likutei Amorim is also in size and in its message, as we call it many times, the perfect manual to Yid's a life in general, and particularly for what the Yid was created for, the human being was created for, the Shamash is kind to serve as masters. That perfect manual laid out in these 53 chapters of Sharichad Memuna. But again, you have the access in this very website to tap to those classes which come up in the same manner. Sharichad Memuna is a second segment, the gateway into oneness and faith. We did mention again, the Rebbe really takes the message of Hashem Echad, and it's not a informative presentation, but a transformative presentation of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We spoke about this in the past. Entering into this gate, one never comes out the same. As we mentioned, best thing is just to stay in there, in the gate of oneness. Enter the gate, and no reason to come out. This is where the ecstasy of Hashem Echad, the experience is all there, and faith takes a different idea when you enter into the Alter Rebbe's gate of Yichud ve'emunah. But so in order to understand the message, but we did say that that you couldn't say the Ches and Tes is grouped together, and Yud coming from Tes. Alter Rebbe says there in the end of Tes that the Sfiros are called the Rosa de Mehemnusa, the secret of Emunah, of faith. Alter Rebbe says, nonetheless, we can appreciate this terminology given by the Chachmei HaEmes, the wise of truth, literally translated. We mentioned that also. It's not their wisdom is not predicated on the way they figured things out, based on their own wisdom. No, it's anchored in the Emes of Torah. the truth of Teda, the truth of Elokus, the truth of godliness, and they define these same spheres as Eires, as lights. Why so? What was their message? And again, just recapping, trying to do this briefly, we never succeed. But let's try even harder. With precision, they call them lights, Eires, with this message that ultimately they're completely bottled, they're completely nullified into the Moyer, into the illuminator, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. And Chas v'Shalom to say HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Chochma Bina Das Chesed Gvura Tiferet Tzachim, is it to define HaKadosh Baruch Hu like that? No, Chas v'Shalom. Chas v'Chalila. As the Alter Rebbe makes it clear also in Perek Ches and Perek Tes, that even to negate wisdom of the Kodesh within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that this Hashem is so profound that I could not understand him. It's mockery. Again, click away in Perek Tes. So all these spheres, they are spheres. It's not that they don't exist, but they just exist l'anhoga ve'in olmin, to lead and guide and establish the phenomenon of Eilamis and ultimately the human being, the idea of the reward and retribution, and so on, and the whole hanhoga. Again, it's not only creation of Eilam, which Alter Rebbe brings hanhoga also, the hanhoga, the conduct of the Creator with His creation. All is via these 10 midas. We mentioned Chochmah Bina Das. The world was created by design, and there's chesed, kindness, and discipline and mercy. This is all associated with Hashem's not only creating, but lanhoga, the conduct of this creation. But it's not the Hashem is Chochmah Bina Das. That's the way Chas v'Shalom to say so. But this is all lies therein within this one manner of defining HaKadosh Baruch Hu spheres by these Chachmei Emes, calling them Eires. And the message, if you recall, and if you don't, just turn back. Literally takes a second. That when you say Eires, lights, there's two ways one could perceive this message. One, their existence, their existence, their being Eires. That's one way of perceiving this message. Another is diametrically the opposite. And the Alter Rebbe says this is really the reason why they call them Eires, because just like light, again, that famous Kal v'Chomer, in other words, Alter Rebbe goes mathematically. If they're able to extend themselves out of the ball of the sun, out of the illuminator, how much more so they are within? They exist within the illuminator. But nonetheless, when they're within the illuminator, you don't see the Eires. They are part of the illuminator to the extent you can't even find them, you can't identify them, they're non-identifiable at all. And the Alter Rebbe says that's the reason why the Chachmei Emes call them Eires, to show their total self-nullification, their total nullification, not only submission to a hierarchy, which is the Moyer, but they are bottled to the extent that they're not identifiable at all. They cannot be identified at all. What you see is only the Moyer. Again, you to understand it a bit clearer, you got to go back to see the Alter Rebbe's this message that the whole reason when the Chachmei Emes call these spheres Eires, not to say they exist. In other words, not to emphasize the is that Chachma is and Bina is within the context of Elokus, to the extent, to the contrary rather, to the whole reason why they call them Eires, to demonstrate their being not their being, but their being not. They're all part and parcel of that Moyer, to the extent that the Eir within the Moyer, the light within the illuminator, cannot be identified at all. Now who says it's there? Maybe they just commence, they initiate out of the ball of, we gave the example, Alter Rebbe gives the example of the sun. You have the Moyer, the illuminator, then you have the Eir, the light coming from the illuminators, and maybe they just begin to exist out of the ball of the sun. That's when you can identify them, and that's when they begin to exist. So maybe Eires is about saying that they are. So Alter Rebbe says, no, that's not true. Because if something which is coming from the Moyer is able to express itself out of the Moyer, out of the illuminator, it ought to be that they are in full existence within the Moyer, within the illuminator. Because if they're able to identify, to come into a being, in other words, to an existent being, or to an identified being out of the Moir. What is their kayach? How does the Eir, how does this light able to express itself out of the illuminator? It's something that transpires when the illuminator, the conclusion or the illuminator is not, and that's when they could come into expression and to manifestation. No, their whole kayach is because of the illuminator. The Eir is there because of the Moir. Point blank. The Eir is there because of the Moir. So if that's the case, the whole Eir, the light, is there because of the illuminator. So they must say that they exist within the illuminator. They don't begin in an area away from where they initiate what gives them the kayach to be an Eir, to be a Metzias, to be an entity of light. It starts within. The only thing is when you're dealing with the Eir, the way they are, it exists within the Moir, within the illuminator. You cannot see them. They're not identifiable at all. They're not identifiable at all. The only thing you see is Moir, which is the illuminator. You look within the ball of the sun, you will not see, you cannot identify at all the Eir, this light. The light begins to be identified, the identifiability of the light, that is, begins when the Moir concludes, when the Moir ends. The ball of the sun ends. Yeah, it has an ending. It's a grand creation. The Rambam writes 176 or 767 rather times the size of the planet, but it's 167, not 168. It stops at a certain point. We don't understand and appreciate that it stops. If not, everything would be sun. The sun stops, and then you can identify the Eir. The Eir comes into a state of identification. But within the Moir it doesn't, and it exists within the Moir because that's where its kayach is. In the illuminator, you only see the illuminator, and that's all. It says this is the reason why the Chachamim call these Chachamim call the Eiros, not to point out that they to emphasize their existence, but to the contrary, to emphasize their nullification of the Moir. That's basically the message. Why are we taking the time? Not fair. Really not fair, because it's really quick way about the Alter Rebbe. So spheres don't exist? Spheres don't exist of that? So, I mean, you're really, erasing, scrapping all this, which it says in Kabbalah and Chassidus, about the 10 spheres, and it's brought in Medrash, and it's brought in Nigla, and Chachamim say, even HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with these 10 midas, Chachma, Bina, Das, and you bring Basar Dvarim, Nibra Ha'elam. It's not Das Sarah Mamoris, as we explain. So we're going to pick up Yud Aleph, Das Sarah Mamoris. The Mamoris is associated with Malchus, the last midah. Not to go there right now. So there's obviously exists. We know that there's Chachma, Bina, Das. At Tochayin Eladam Das, Amlam Elenish Bina. There is Chachma Bina Das in all levels, in all elements, and within the human being as well. If you have Chachma Bina, where's it coming from? Obviously, it's coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The world is created with Chachma B'Tvunim Das and Chesed, and then Chesed says Sheishis Yamosas Shemayim Za'aretz, and it deals with, says the Sheishes. These are the 6 midas. Again, it's brought in so many places, and not only what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did and perform with these 10 minutes, the 10 spheres. 10 spheres, that Tzilas primarily. The spheres in which we talk about in their primordial state, in the original iconic world of Atzilus. So you just said the spheres are completely bottled to because then they're essentially non-existent, and that's the reason why the Chachmim call them Eidos. Dr. Rebbe says, Lan Hogavei Nalmin. It's not that this is who the Eibishter is. The Kodesh Baruch Hu established the spheres to conduct the Eilamis. But it's not who you are. And again, I'm not going to repeat all the details. You could see it in the previous classes. The Alter Rebbe goes on and says and shows you and demonstrates. Actually, he doesn't go on with all the spheres. He speaks about Chachma Bina Das. The world was created by design. We could all appreciate that. He goes on with the 2 spheres, showing you how the world was created with Chesed, which we learned last week. And today we're holding Mimei Masheni, the first day of creation. Mimei Masheni, in the second day of creation, Niglas Midas Gvura. The attribute of Gvura was revealed, which is the second Midah. And again, this is all on Hagav Hainom, and we gave last week an example. It's something seems to be so real, but it's not real at all. We gave the example with the master and the pupil. It looks so real, all this with the master saying to the student, this story, this metaphor, but the master is not a storyteller, even though to the recipient or anybody hears for the first time this master conveying, relating his message, his teachings, looks like a perfect storyteller, but the master is not a storyteller. Again, worthwhile perhaps to see it. That we mentioned it, I think we mentioned in this very chapter, one of the classes. It looks real at this way, but it's not. That's not who the master is at all. And the same thing, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is like the first day Chesed, and the second day Gvura, which we're learning over here. But it's not who the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. And Alter Rebbe concludes this chapter with this very saying of Eliyahu Hanavi in the Pasach Eliyahu, Lav di Yislach Tzedek di Yedin v'lei Mishpat di Yerachmi v'lav mikolim Yizkal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not about Midas, but let's see, let's follow over here. In the second day, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam. In the second day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, used the Midas HaGvura. But this Midas HaGvura is Kul Mishar Midas HaRetzeinei. I spoke about last week. You don't have to mention this detail. It's known. It's particularly Neil Matikon, like we spoke last week. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Midas, they're all included. They all complement each other. They're all included from each other. So the idea of Gvura is very clear. There was separation. Separation is about discipline. It's about removal, not about inclusion, but to a certain extent exclusion. That there's the rakia, the firmament, there's the waters on high and then the waters below, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu established that division. Division is about discipline. Stay away, meaning to say, it's the opposite of chesed, which is closeness, fusion. This is separation, which is associated with gvura, understandably so. So where's the inclusion of the other? Where do you see the midas gvura as it harmonizes? We used the terminology last week. In other words, they include themselves with all the other midas. Every midas, he says, you see it. First of all, predominantly, you see the expression of gvura here. Ubora barakia, yirakia b'sechamayim v'imavdil b'mayim havdalah, separation, which is tzimtzum. Separation comes from contraction. Ugvurais, and severity, discipline, to separate, to conceal the spiritual waters on high, then the waters below, which comes through contraction. Now, interesting enough, when we think about the rakia, the firmament, you see the idea of gvura, the division, as opposed to inclusion. But we always think about the mayim, that there was the water on high, physical water, and the water below. The water, in other words, the water on high and below, both physical water. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu divided it with the firmament, with the rakia, in order that there should be the mayim tachtainim. Again, separation. Eventually, a world will be formed. That eventually, after this division, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu establishes the Abasha, but that only comes through the division. But Alter Rebbe says over here, which sheds light on this idea of gvura, contraction, concealment, that the Mayim Eliyim are not physical waters, they're spiritual waters. So now that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put up this rakia to divide, to conceal, to contract the spiritual Mayim, which with spiritual waters you don't and yet cannot create a physical world. Because if it's all spirituality, you don't have the physical waters, and you don't have the physical yabasha, which dry land, which will come as such, and metaphorically for sure. But you don't have the physical world, and what's so important about the physical world? Maybe you should remain with a spiritual presentation, the spiritual elam, which exists also in high. Maybe you should have left it like that instead of the rakia, and eventually would be mayim gashmi, physical waters, which again, this is the contraction of the spiritual light in order that it should establish itself and then be manifest in a physical mind, ultimately a physical world, because the answer is simple, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Nisava HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Liyas like Dira B'Tachtein. You should never lose focus and sight. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted a dwelling place in this very physical world. In a physical world, in a Tachtein. So this is part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's master plan. Therefore, it's not just there's the Ayve dealing with this Helen Behester, this very contraction which we're talking about over here. And it could be confusing, it could be dejecting, but nonetheless, the Yid takes his expression bull by the horns and starts his Avodah, and that's where the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. You can see it also in the 36th and 37th and beyond chapters, namely starting from 36 in Likutei Amarim, not Shari Chumash. Has 12 chapters. Likutei Amarim, also a click away. You can see this whole idea of that dafka, the gashmis of Elam Hazeh, that's where the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, because that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu created everything. Nisav HaKadosh Baruch Hu lislidira b'tachteinim. So this is the tachtin which was created through this expression of gvura, this severity, this contraction of creator from creation. That was the meaning, that is the meaning of the rakia, the firmament, the division. Now the spiritual will be contracted, and as such, which is again the idea of gvura, contraction, discipline, it's going to remain within, and what is going to express itself and be manifest is the physical Elam Hazeh, the physical waters. So you see gvura, where is the other midas? Or where's the midah of chesed, which we just came from the very first day? The answer, because this is chesed. Because in order the Eibishter should be able to implement this, or give the Yid the opportunity to execute this master plan associated with the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it desired that he should have a dira, dwelling place b'tachtenim, in this very physical world. So a physical world has to unfold. So that is the chesed, that through this physical water, eventually the abasha comes out, the dry land. And man is created and lives in dry land. Man cannot just exist, could go out into the waters, but the place of man is on the abasha, on dry land, and there he can do his avodah, and making a HaKadosh Baruch Hu dira b'tachteinim. Could you think about a greater chesed than connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's, and connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the deepest level within HaKadosh Baruch Hu? As a Yid did in the Meibishtin, a Yid should serve the Eibishtin. There's no greater chesed than that. There's no greater expression of kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He establishes this whole phenomenon of Beidas Hashem. A Yid din the Meibishtin. What's so special about that? It's not because it looks good, no, because it's aligned with the master plan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to have a dira b'tachtenim. So the gvura is obviously very much kol included of chesed, of the kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As the Alter Rebbe explained, it goes on, umidas chesed klula ba. Because Elam, the attribute of kindness, is included in this expression of gvura. On the surface, there's a lot of gvura, the contraction, the discipline. The gashmi is coming out because of the helam vaster of the ruchnis, the contraction of the spiritual. This is the rakia, which came about the second day, which the second day is about gvura. It's obvious, but the midas chesed is klula ba, is also included. Why? Elam chesed yibana. The world was created for chesed, and what's the chesed? The kindness over here, for which the entire world was created. That it's all that the physical yabasha, dry land, should appear and should be seen. In other words, should be able to be manifest the way it is, a physical world and a physical yabasha. And man to be created on this yabasha, on this land, Hashem, to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No, doesn't have to explain why serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the greatest chesed. So when you have the gvura, you have the chesed, cool. But the Alter Rebbe is saying, and that's all what happened on the second day. And the third day, midas rachmanas, tiferes. Let's explain the Kabbalah, this third association with the third day, the creation of the third day, to the midah of rachmanas, and netzach and haid, yiseg malchus. But the Alter Rebbe chooses two, because the Alter Rebbe is not to veer from the Alter Rebbe's message. The Alter Rebbe's message is lanhog. The whole reason why there's svidus is just lanhoga b'hain olmin, just to conduct the Olam, is to create and to conduct the Olam, but that's not a definition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because these items are truly included in the Ma'ir, the Illuminator, as such. Hence, no existence, no identity on their own at all. And as we mentioned, even in the taking from that very parable of the sun, the Oir, when it's in the sun, it's not existent, but the sun comes to a stop. and then the Eir shows up. In other words, the Eir, you're able to identify the Eir. And the Eir, where it is, it's Eir. It's not Mo'ir. In other words, the illuminator comes to stop. The Eir picks up. And you always have that dveikus of Eir and Mo'ir, understandably. There's no Mo'ir, there's no Eir, but yet it's two separate. What comes to the surface is two separate messages, if you will. One the Mo'ir and one the Eir. The Eir comes after the Eir. There's this stop in the end of the Mo'ir, the end of the illuminator. Then you see the Eir, the light, the warmth, and the shine, and so on and so forth. The real area, place, domain of this Eir is within the Mo'ir, and in the Mo'ir you don't see the Eir, which is Dr. Rebbe's message over here. But from this mashal itself, you can glean that the sun comes to a stop. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you can't say, oh, the illuminator, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, oh, this is where he stops, and then the Eir picks up. It can't be, because Malay Kalad is Kavedi. Ani Mali, so Shemayim starts Ani is the core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Moir, the Kavedi, like the Al-Dalashon, Al-Terem, Mahusi, Batzmusei. The core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mali Shemayim Baretz. Leisa Sar Poni Mini, there's no domain which is devoid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Moir is always here. As such, the Eir is always buckling to the Moir. In other words, the non-existence of the Eir, which are these 10 Sviris, in the face of the Moir, the illuminator of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is constant, it's default. And therefore, they're truly not and that was the message of Chachmei Emes. It's about them not being, not about them being. And when you see these spheres, it's just like Nagabein Olmi, just to establish Eilamis. And that's what Eliyahu once said, this is what Eliyahu writes in Tikkunim. Sham there, and again the famous Pasach Eliyahu, Lachzor to see Echisnaig Olmo B'Tzedek U'Mishpat. That the whole reason why there's these Midas Chesed Gvura is to see the world, to see to it that the world is conducted with Tzedek U'Mishpat, with righteousness and justice. And he says Tzedek in Eliyahu Navi continues all the quote of Eliyahu Navi, Tzedek Yudin Mishpat Yirach. Justice is associated about law. And righteousness, rather, associated with law, and justice with rachmanis, with mercy. That itself we have to understand. One would think mishpat, rachamim, doesn't seem like there is any correlation. But if you look deeper, it's explained in other places, which is not the theme over here of, or it's not the emphasis of the class of the Alter Rebbe's message, rather, to explain why tzedek is dina mishpati rachmi. It's explained elsewhere, but generally, just to say this peripherally, tzedek, righteousness. It ought to be so because the law demands so. Mishpat is justice, meaning to say, let's bring justice into the law. And in this context, we will establish mercy. In other words, to introduce a certain sense of justice within the law, within the righteousness, which means the way it ought to be. You establish justice to bring about something which would make people comfortable. And if it's two people arguing in the context of the law, the psak din is like one. The notion, even in halach, of compromise, or by law this is meant to be so, rightfully so, righteousness, rightfully so. Let's bring some mishpat in order that the recipient to feel better, which is the idea of rachmanis, pity. Yeah, it's meant to be so, but we'll establish and we'll express a certain compassion. And again, this is in brief what the connection of mishpat to rachamei is, as it's mentioned in a number of places. But in the message of the Alter Rebbe, and ultimately the message of Pasach Eliyahu, is kula, or namely the message via Pasach Eliyahu, by Eliyahu Navi and Pasach Eliyahu, is kula, all these midas, is lachza, and again chulu. Chulu means to say it's not limited to this midah, all Hashem's midas, kula, lachza, to see, echisnai golmo, to see to it, to allow, and to bring in this hisnagus of almo, meaning to say the creation, the emanation, and ultimately the conduct of Hashem's world. And that's the whole reason, says Eliyahu Navi, why there existed 10 spheres. Avalav makes it very clear, lav de islach tzedek yidiyah de yudim. It's not that you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says Eliyahu Navi, have this tzedek, this righteousness, which is called din. V'loi mishpat yediyu diyu rachami. And when you're talking about the you, the loch of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is no known mishpat, which is again translated in Rachmanis. No. V'lav mikol inun midas klal is the conclusion of Eliyahu Navi in that statement in Pasach Eliyahu, and the final words of the Perek Yud, that there is in V'lav mikol, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not at all about midas, in a way to say that I'm going to define HaKadosh Baruch Hu because I see a certain conduct of chesed. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is intrinsically a matter of chesed, or a gvura. He is essentially rather chesed and essentially gvura. No, v'lav mikol inin midis klal. Because when you're talking about the spheres, they're all bottled within HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because when you talk about Muhusi B'atzmus Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not there. There's the illuminator HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and as such define me as Chesed, Gvura, Chochmah, Bina, Das. No, it's completely not. It's only HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's only Muhusi B'atzmus Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And from that area, which is the area of Emes, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Malei Kol Haaretz K'veidei, or beyond that, as Shemayim Esaretz Ani Malei, Las Asar Ponim Minei, so there's no real midas which are Chas V'Chalil defining HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when you have the midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is Kulo just Lachzo Eichi Snai Galma, Lan Hogo V'Heinolmin, like the Lashon, just to conduct Elamis. And that is definitely a dichotomy within Svedis, but again, that's what we introduced. It's worthwhile to see that sometimes you see something which seems to be very real. The famous explanation of the Alter Rebbe, which is the message in the earlier chapters of Shaykh B'Emunah, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin. Rebbe introduces in Likutei Amorim, the original, in the Likutei Amorim, in chapter 20 and 21, this idea that, yeah, it looks like it's real. There he says Hashem's dibur, and dibur is expressing oneself, taking this which is within and expressing itself outwards, and it seems as such as a separate entity without that ever writes there. And he concludes with the same words that he concludes the Perek Vav in Shaykh B'Emunah Hashem Hu Elikim. It's not the way it appears. It's the truth is Hashem Hu Elikim. And again, the example we gave, the master is not a storyteller, even though to the pupil doesn't see anything else in the onset. But no, he is an Amkon Godel. He is somebody who is extremely, has hands-on. We gave the mashal of the scholarship of Torah. We kept with that example. He's all about the depth and breadth of the Torah and the entire Torah, and he just accepted upon himself this mandate to teach the child, and therefore he ought to begin with things which are light, if it's a story or if it's an example. And that's all the student on the onset knows about this person sitting in front of him. But that's not who he is at all. It just appears so because there's an objective, there's a goal that the master is trying to achieve, to bring the student into the fold of the scholarship of Torah. So he uses that in order to be successful with this teaching, with this delivering of and relating and delivering the messages of Torah, and ultimately elevating the student to the level of knowledge and scholarship and Torah, to the extent it says that the child one day, this student would be able to reach the levels of the Talmud, the master himself. Which you see this message in one hand, yeah, that's a long time, 40 years is a long time, but it could be the Rabbi, that he is elevated to the level of his own master. And that's the objective, and that's the goal, and therefore he starts with these teaspoon messages, story, metaphors, and so on and so forth, but that's not who he is, which is again a mashal to this idea that's not at all the definition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's just Eichis Naigalma about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lav Mikol Inin Midis Klal. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not about Midis at all. Have a wonderful night.